Leather is an incredible material that has been used throughout history for clothing and tools. The early processes used to make leather and craft with it remain very similar to some of those still used today. The history of leather and leathercraft has very close ties to people all around the world, and that history began around 400,000 years ago in Hackney, England. Its evolution can be traced around the world and through the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, ancient times, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, and all the way into today. During each period in history, cultures around the world have found valuable uses for leather in their daily lives. Let's explore. First, we'll look at the leather worker. Leather has been used for thousands of years as a protective and useful material. Man has often used as many parts of animals as possible for survival and to develop tools for easier and better living. Leather footwear, for example, allowed for easier walking and exploring. When around animals large enough, their hides could be turned into clothing. In colder climates, the fur on top of leather provided excellent warmth. In warmer climates, the hides could be used for shade and to help stay cool. Leathercraft was mainly oriented around function. As man evolved and societies built up, so did the uses for leather. Its applications would grow into leather armor, boots, satchels, tents, writing surfaces, harnesses, and jewelry. In some cultures, leather was seen as a symbol of high status. Leathercraft was becoming about both function and visual appeal. For leather's evolution, further as time went on, leather would become a staple in most everyone's life. Mass-produced leather shoes, gloves, jackets, and bags and accessories became widely available. Leathercraft was now a full-fledged industry. It had a global supply chain for raw materials and an equally large body of international consumers excited to buy and use leather goods. The demand is so high that even faux or synthetic leather material that's often made from plastics and other compounds are becoming popular to meet that demand. They also serve as less expensive, more nature-friendly options for leather sourcing. Few materials have been around so long and used so widely as leather. It's incredible to see how the craft has evolved over time and to learn how far it's come from the earliest days. Leather in the Stone Age, prehistory to 3000 BC. The Stone Age is one of the longest periods in more recent history. It covers millions of years, though we begin to see evidence of leatherworking and the birth of leathercraft around 400,000 years ago. The earliest stone tools known to date are around 3.3 million years old. They were flakes of stone, likely used for cutting. These stone flakes could have been used to skin hides from animals and scrape them to clean them as an early step of the tanning process. Though it isn't until around 400,000 BC that we begin to see evidence of more leather-specific tools. The first leather tools. There were stone scraping tools found in modern-day Hackney, England. When examining the microscopic wear patterns on the scrapers from their use, researchers were able to conclude that they were likely used specifically in scraping hides. This scraping would help prepare them for preservation, tanning, and use. If we look forward a few 100,000 years to around 82,000 BC, we begin to see bone awls in South Africa. Larger than sewing needles, the awls might have been used to pierce the hides of leather material. The leather hides and furs could be joined together to make larger clothing and shelter coverings. The first common leather items. Around 33,000 BC, the first sewing needles, with eyes for thread, or some material that would function similarly, were found in Siberia. This provided a shift, as between the awls to make holes and the needles to pass thread through, leathercraft could begin to offer more to daily life. Items could be shaped to the different needs, they could be repaired, and allow creative thinking to find new uses for them. Fats could also be rubbed into the leather to help provide them some waterproofing qualities. Some of the oldest operations, specifically for leather tanning, were found from around 5000 BC in Sumer, which is modern-day Iraq. The oldest leather shoe, with leather laces, dates to around 3500 BC in Armenia. In ancient Egypt, around 3100 BC, leather was used to make chariot harnesses and couplings. Leather in the Bronze Age, 3000 BC to 1200 BC. Stone tools, even those used for leatherworking, were still very popular in the Bronze Age, although advancements in technology and tools started a movement towards specialization and trade. One group with the knowledge and tools to do one thing very well, such as farming, could produce goods and then trade them with another group that had the resources, knowledge, and ability to make another. With increased trade came a wider evolution of tanning animal hides into leather. Along with advancements in tanning came advancements in leathercraft. Leather would be used for a larger variety of goods, ranging from shoes to capes, belts, hats, arm protectors, shields, and shelters. As an example of the leathercraft of the period, a leather shoe was discovered from around 1300 BC. It was made from a single piece of leather with holes for laces. The back of the shoe was still laced up, forming the curve around the back of the ankle. Tools were used to remove hair from the leather, leaving a smooth finish. And fine combs, likely made of bone, were used to finish off the leather's surface. These are large advancements in the art of leathercraft. Leather in the Iron Age, 1200 BC to 550 BC. The Iron Age saw continued growth of community and population. Farming became more advanced, which allowed for easier food production and easier support of families. With more people came an increased need for goods, including leather goods. Small cities grew larger, and there was additional leisure time, and some of the clothing grew more colorful. Leather shoes and sandals with leather laces were still very popular, as were belts, capes, and even jewelry. While leather can degrade and disintegrate over time if exposed to the elements, there is one example of a leather armband dating from around the end of the Iron Age. It was worn by the old Krogan man, a 6'6" male, that was extremely tall for the time. His fingernails were well groomed, signaling that he was in a privileged social class. Around his upper arm, he wore a braided leather armband. It included bronze mounts that both held the leather together and served a decorative function. This was quite a discovery to find leather that was worn thousands of years ago. Leathercraft was surely evolving. Leather in ancient India, 3000 BC to 600 BC. The Indian culture is steeped in history and very closely integrated with world history. Leather was also very valued in ancient India. Early Hindu scriptures were written in the Sanskrit language, captured in a volume called Vedas. Around 3000 BC, in the Rig Veda, there is a reference to items made from leather. These included bottles and water-carrying bags called mashaks. Other literary references from the period also mention common articles made from leather for use in everyday life, such as leather bands, straps, laces, and similar cord-like implements. It was clear that leather was very respected and needed during this time. Leather in ancient Egypt, 2700 BC to 350 BC. Ancient Egyptians generally wore very light clothing, given the warm environment they lived in. Leather accessories were available, though usually to wealthier individuals with a higher social standing. For example, leather sandals were worn by the wealthy. Less wealthy individuals wore sandals made of woven papyrus. Other uses for leather were common in this period. Chariot harnesses and couplings were fashioned from this strong material. Working on this type of leathercraft also would have required some level of tanning knowledge and cutting, joining skill, especially on equipment that would be traveling quickly and exposed to rough riding. Leather jewelry was also available to the wealthy. Another interesting use is leather as a writing surface. Some examples have been found where leather was used to create Egyptian manuscripts. These are long rolls of leather. When unrolled, they would feature images and words inscribed onto them, reflecting on the life and culture of the time. Think of it like an early, rolled-up book. Some research points to Egypt being the origin of some plant-based leather tanning processes. In this time period, we begin to see more widespread and specialized use of leather. Thankfully, a fair amount of examples survived that allow us to analyze and learn more about them. Leather in ancient China, 1600 BC to 200 BC. China has long been a very advanced civilization. Its history goes back thousands of years, and along with it, the history of leather. As with other cultures at that time, China used leather for common dress, such as shoes. They would later use it for making boots. Of key interest is the Chinese leather armor. Seeking to protect themselves in battle and provide an edge over the opponent, leather crafters would produce elaborate leather tunics for warriors to wear. Armor was generally custom fit to the wearer and made from cowhides. Other examples from the period include armor made from rhinoceros and buffalo hides. The extent of leather protection did not stop there. Leather armor was also fashioned for shields and helmets. Even armor for horses was crafted, providing full protection for both soldier and horse when engaged in battle. This is a significant use of the material in the history of leather, also considering the amount needed for a leather crafter to produce a full suit of armor for a person and a horse. Leather in ancient Greece, 800 BC to 200 BC. Citizens in ancient Greece often enjoyed a warmer climate. Staple clothing generally consisted of a light linen tunic. Shoes weren't always worn, though when needed or preferred, lace-up leather sandals were a common option and provided good protection for the feet. It is believed that the vegetable tanning process was developed by the Greeks. It possibly could have begun in Egypt, and the knowledge refined further. Rome would later adopt similar practices. Vegetable tanning involves using naturally derived tannins, elements from plants and bark, to help produce the leather. The Greeks would use leather for various items including sandals, shields, protective wear, and bags for carrying items. Chariots, other military gear, and cavalry units likely had some leather straps and supports, as well as tack on and around ships as needed. Although not commonplace, some athletic-focused clothing was made from leather to provide increased support. Leather in ancient Rome, 750 BC to 500 CE. With Rome being one of the most complex and advanced civilizations in history, there is surely a place for leather. By this point in time, there were highly efficient social structures in place that would allow for specialized, high-volume production of items. This included foods, clothing, and personal accessories. Hides for leather often came from butchers, who processed the animals for food and their additional valuable parts. Along with vegetable tanning, the Romans also utilized another method of tanning referred to as alum tanning. Alum is a salt compound that helped produce a softer leather that also more easily accepted dyes. This is where the more common and still used aluminum tanning originated. Dyes could be used to produce brightly colored leathers that had a great visual appeal. As cities became more populated and industries built up, we begin to see the separation of some working and living neighborhoods. The leather tanning process, especially in ancient Rome, produces some very unpleasant smells. As such, one would often find the tanneries located distances from living quarters and dwellings to help maintain a more enjoyable standard of living. Leather in ancient Rome was also used in volume for the formative Roman army. Horses would need reins and straps, chariots would need leather fixtures, and soldiers would need belts, sandals, boots, and protective equipment. Leather was a very common and helpful material in the Roman Empire. Leather in the Dark Ages, 500 CE to 800 CE. The Dark Ages saw advancements in leathercraft. Leather was being used for even more purposes, and the skills used to work with it growing even finer. Shoes began to be more closed in design and made from multiple pieces of leather, joining a sole to the upper. Previously, many shoe designs were a single piece of leather laced up around the foot with leather laces. Bags and straps of various sizes were still very common. During this time, we start seeing leather used for the backs of seats and chairs, usually with a soft material behind it to provide for a more durable and comfortable surface on which to rest. So while there wasn't extensive intellectual progress, as we'll see later during the Renaissance, the history of leather and leathercraft was still very much evolving during this time. Leather in the Viking Age, 800 CE to 1000 CE. The Vikings extensively used leather. While not as common as wools for clothing, it still saw frequent use in footwear and accessories. Shoe styles varied greatly, offering different fits and looks and levels of protection. Ankle and calf height boots would also be popular. Leather laces would wrap around the footwear and help secure them in place. Leather would be used to make hats to protect the head and retain heat in colder temperatures. Belts and bags were common items also made from leather. Pouches could be used to carry personal items and whatever was needed for a typical day. As we see in other civilizations, leather also has a common place in military and protective uses. Vikings used leather to make shields, sword scabbards, knife sheaths, slings, straps, helmets, saddlery, and protective garments. These provided some armoring of the soldiers. Leather goods were also not available to all soldiers, though to those who had the means to acquire it, they had definite benefits above the standard cloth gear. Leather in the Middle Ages, 1000 to 1300 CE. Leathercraft and popularity continued to grow in the Middle Ages. Here, we begin to see much more practice around evolved leather working, such as tooling, carving, dyeing, and painting. We see applique, where items are attached to leather both for functional and decorative reasons. Around the same time, there are advancements in sewing implements and threads. For example, using boar bristles as needles. They are thick, flexible, and strong, allowing them to be passed through leather materials while pulling thread along with them. The history of leather in the 11th century wasn't limited to just leather. The threads and types used see advances and specialized metal tools for leather becoming more popular. These include those for marking and making holes through the material. Additionally, the Middle Ages saw a visually popular trend that is related to leather. This is the design of the Krakow shoe. The shoe has a very elongated, often curved end with a pointy tip. While some might think they look odd or even humorous, at the time they served a very important social function. The longer and more curved the toe, the higher up on the social class someone was. For royalty, some toes were several feet long, and that's a lot of leather for a shoe. Also during this time, leather trade guilds started to form. The leather craft required a fair amount of knowledge to tan, to process, and dye, and work with that leather. It also required specialized tools to work with, so it was deemed really important to create a way to keep this information within groups. First, it helped to develop a means by which to pass knowledge on to future generations. Also, it helped protect the knowledge and the livelihood of leather crafters. Leather in the Renaissance. The Renaissance brings vast intellectual growth to the world, driven from Italy. Leather use, craft, and tooling expanded in virtually all areas. Function was meshed with form, ideas with new concepts, material with new uses. Ornamental seating utilized leather, turning basic chairs into pleasing sights and status symbols. Leather guilds became more popular, and tanning industries began to build up around Tuscany and Florence. Leather stamping, molding, and shaping was performed both for function and for art. Increased global trade led to more localization and specialization, additional refinement of both process and craft. Leather was used for all sorts of items, from functional shoes, belts, clothing, to hats and pants, jerkins, which are vests worn over clothes, capes, overcoats, bags, cloaks, satchels, and bookbindings. Leather straps and ties were used across military needs, including some of the attachments and harnesses under armor. Some of these included bodily protection, saddlery, shields, quivers, frogs, and pouches. With the Renaissance came popularity of rarer, more expensive materials such as silk, satin, and velvet. So leather accessories and finished goods still sat in the upper class of materials, reserved mainly for nobility and the wealthy. Leather in the Enlightenment, 1650 to 1760. Leather and leathercraft during the Enlightenment shifted a bit from the technical evolution of things to the socio-political side of things. With many solid leather industries established around the world and major world powers settling and controlling new lands, the focus was on controlling production, distribution, and the commercial side of leather. Around 1700, England tried to force the American colonies to use British hides and purchase British leather goods, restricting free sourcing and manufacture. Around the world, regional styles of leather and design of goods were gaining global attention. France made high-fashion shoes, Spain was making refined leather armor, The world powers were beginning to become commercial powers, and leather was certainly a part of it. For leather goods made during this time, things included bags, satchels, boots, hats, shoes, belts, and all sorts of military bags and accoutrements, straps and ties. Leather trim was on trunks, on the grips of knives and swords. It was decorative for photo frames and used extensively for binding books. The history of leather took a leap forward in the 17th century. As it became more integrated into daily life, leather didn't miss a beat. Leather in the Industrial Revolution, 1760 to 1840. The history of leather in the 18th century and the Industrial Revolution brought about sweeping global change. The introduction of widespread mechanized technology allowed industries to produce much, much more and much, much faster. This drove the need for resource and raw materials that were needed to produce, run, and maintain these machines. It also led to the development of machines to make many manual production steps easier, faster, and more accurate. Machines helped make the leather tanning process faster. They were also used to split leather, separating the different layers of the hide, in a method that produced clean, smooth, accurate, repeatable results. This was huge. Finished leathers were faster than ever to produce. Regions built up around the new technology, with tanneries and production facilities grouping together near the resources needed for production. These were mainly hides and sources of water and tanning compounds. This was especially true around the central states and the American colonies. As a growing nation, centralized industry helped feed the country's development. Patent leather was developed in 1818. It is a type of coated leather with a high gloss finish, giving it a very pleasing appearance. This would become a very popular new type of leather for shoes. And leather was also used for everything it was before, including clothing, bags and hats, belts, military accoutrements, boots, shoes, horse tack, leather coaches, and everyday items. Even leather belts to drive the now popular machines drove a new and increased demand for the material. During the Industrial Revolution, global leather production reached its peak in all of history. Leather in the Victorian Age. Even as leather production would slow from its peak during the Industrial Revolution, the Victorian Age would still have contributions to the history of leather and leathercraft. In 1858, chromium tanning was invented. It utilized minerals in a much quicker process than the widely practiced vegetable tanning method. Also referred to as chrome tan, this process enabled leather to be produced faster, thinner, and softer. All of those qualities were good for the leather industry. This would be the beginning of a major shift in leather tanning methods. Over time, chrome tan leather would rise in popularity and eventually overtake vegetable tan leathers in overall production volume. As of the early 2000s, only about 10% of tanned leather is vegetable tanned, and 90% is chrome tanned. With chrome tan leather production on the rise, the market was ripe for expansion into leather crafters. The market was ripe for expansion for leather crafters to make goods for nearly every consumer need imaginable. This history of leather in the 19th century would change for good. Additionally, the first faux or synthetic vegan leathers were developed in Germany. It was called Prestoff. It was manufactured from uniquely treated paper pulp. It generally functioned well, though it would begin to come apart during applications where exposed to moisture and repeated flexing. Leather in the Progressive Era, 1900 to 1950. By 1925, the average leather tanner in the USA had around 100 employees. There were about 560 large-scale leather tanneries in the United States at the time. Mechanized processes were getting better, so good that some were able to replace the hand stitching usually required on some leather goods. These included things like books, shoes, gloves, and bags. The number of employees needed to run the machines increased, though the leather craft that had developed over thousands of years began to be turned over to the machines. The hand skills, honed over time, were overtaken by tireless machines, churning out product non-stop. The quality of machines might not reach the fine level of some handwork, though for the majority of needs and the majority of customers, it was good enough. And this presented a major shift in the types of labor needed by the leather industry. Added to this, the surge in technological developments coming out of 2 world wars led to a tremendous amount of new materials entering the commercial pipeline. These included plastics and rubbers, 2 materials that would directly impact the need for leather. Leather in modern times, 1950 to the present day. With the world wars over and global focus on stability and prosperity, the global marketplace surged. Exports and imports were on the rise, and certainly included leather. While synthetic leathers had been around since the 19th century, in 1963, the first major faux leather was produced by DuPont. It was generally made from a polyester, that's a plastic fiber, as a base with a polyurethane, also plastic, coating. Later, leatherette, another synthetic leather made from covering fibers with PVC, another plastic, was introduced. Now, leather, quote unquote, didn't even need to be leather to be produced. More and more companies were using synthetic leathers, rubbers, and plastic for products. There was a natural decline in demand for real leather, and the global economy was shifting out of an outsourced model. The theory is that by shifting production to countries with lower wages and material costs, they can be produced more cheaply, resulting in a cost savings. This led to a shift in leather production to developing countries, who would produce leathers less expensively. Between manufacturers using different raw materials, such as plastics and rubbers, and leather production shifting to other countries, the once burgeoning leather industry in the United States slowed dramatically. By 1997, employment in leather-related industries fell by almost 50%. United States imports of leather shoes rose to 82% by 1995. So only 18% of shoes purchased in the country were actually made in the United States. That's a huge difference from the 1850s, when almost 16% of all workers employed in America worked in the leather-related trades. So leather, while still valued for its unique characteristics and high-quality goods that it could produce, became just one material among many in day-to-day life. What a ride, and what a journey. Leather has taken us throughout time, literally, through cultures and through world change. It's a material that reflected the need to survive, levels of social class, and levels of luxury. It's helped fight wars, win freedoms, and drive global commercial change. It covers the books that we've read and inspires the clothing that we wear. Even to this day, leather has touched almost everyone in some way. A true testament to this material that is ever a part of human history and the history of leather. There are so many ways to look at and learn from history. Here's to exploring, enjoying, and learning together.